Western civilization is moving closer to a point of irreconcilable, unstable equilibrium, as frighteningly increasing numbers of people trust nothing. Media, academia, and especially the governments are no longer held in high esteem. Regaining trust is often impossible after betrayal. However, transparency is essential to any healing process, and that is the essence of the Don Sullivan Show. Please listen to the team explore, probe, and debate cutting-edge science, technology, and computing. Play ball! Welcome back to the Don Sullivan Show, everyone. This is the show where we discuss all things science, technology, and computing on a level that can be understood and absorbed by your average teenager. We really appreciate you all listening in again, and we're going to, as we often do, and we will always do in the Don Sullivan Show, is deviate all over the place under that large umbrella of science, technology, and computing. So I'm your host, Don Sullivan, but let me introduce you to my partner and continuous sidekick in this show, who is going to have a big part in this one. Wait till I tell you what the subject is. Say hello, Jersey Steve.
Greetings from New Jersey, everyone.
Today, we are again recording from my office basement in Littleton, Colorado. As you know, we're going to be all over the world, and we have been a few times so far, but we're going to be all over the world with lots of different episodes. But I also want you to just quickly say hello to my honored guest, a friend of mine for the last 25 years, an Oracle certified master who I worked with at Oracle and was part of the VMware Experts program when I worked at VMware, Mr. Howard Ostrow. Say hello, Howard.
Hello.
Howard says hello. Thank you, Howard. And wait till I tell you the subject here. But first, again, the insistence of our lawyers, I need to read out the obligatory disclaimer waiver. So all statements by the hosts and guests on the Don Sullivan Show are the personal opinions of the hosts and the guests, who all agree that the following content is the property of Analytics LLC to be used publicly and exclusively on the Don Sullivan Show. And that's it. Everybody agree? Great. Let's get moving on. Let's have a lot of fun here. So today, we're going to talk about music. In fact, the science or the physics of music. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it as well. We're going to keep it pretty broad because we want to have a lot of shows, a lot of narrow subjects about music and how music works, how music physically works, how music relates to the world of physics and even subatomic particle physics, but most importantly, how music makes us feel good, how music gives us a pleasant and harmonious feeling, how music makes us go to sleep, how somebody who can't sing a lick like me can get my 2-year-old granddaughter to sleep by singing old Beatles songs. How the hell does that happen? That's just crazy, right? Because I just sound awful. But Howard doesn't, and Howard's going to have a lot to talk about. Howard, why don't you give us, did I introduce you properly? You want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Oh, you did introduce me correctly. I've been involved in music for quite a long time, ever since I first held a guitar, which was around age 13. I felt this connection, deep connection to it. And as soon as I started at least reaching the point where I could actually independently think and listening to the AM radio that my mother did, I began to pick up upon music, popular music, and it soon actually kind of consumed me. And I'm one of those people who memorized lyrics by far better than I did in things in mathematics and other things. So I've always been attracted to it. And
you dabbled a little bit in music engineering, right?
Well, yes. I entered the music engineering field in my early 20s, and it was an amazing journey. It's to experience it from that end of it. Not so much from the performing end, but from the actual, what it takes to actually record, the changes that happen to the music during that recording process. So I've seen it from a number of different angles, and I did everything. I produced it, I created jingles, I went ahead and took the things to mastering. I didn't master them myself. That's another science and art in its own right. But that all came together, and of course, then I went into technology. Reason being is that it actually more people owed me money than actually ever paid me, and that didn't work that way in technology. And of course,
that's a business discussion.
And there are parallels that are there. I've always been interested in music technology. I've been interested in
that's a great segue to really how I want to start off this discussion, Howard. And I want to start off by asking you, why do we as human beings love music? Why does it make our lives better?
Music is a cultural universal. And the reason why is because, and every culture has some form of music. It could be somebody playing a flute that they fashioned themselves. It could be somebody who takes a log and takes another piece of wood and starts banging it. That's been there since humans have been able to actually have opposable thumbs so they can grab things. And there's something about that that resonates very deeply within us. And I think the reason why is because we search for patterns, we search for things. And music is the one thing that actually, since it's universal, it appeals to us. We hear a pattern and we feel this emotion. We are emotional creatures. And music reinforces that emotions. Think about it this way. Think about songs that you remember. And when you remember them, you think about an event that could have been your first girlfriend.
Absolutely.
It could have been your first heartbreak from the first girlfriend. Maybe a song that you shared. You may not have thought of that girlfriend in a long time, but when you hear the song, what happens? You instantly remember that. That's very compelling. When you think about a written word, you read it and the author supplies that information, and we use our imaginations to pull it on out. Think about music. If I write something, I give you that information. You hear that information. You feel that information. That's very compelling. I'm not to downgrade the written word at all. But think about it. The written word is something that we can do. We have opposable thumbs. We can grab a pen. We can write it down. We can type on a typewriter. What about a whale? Well, they're mammals, but they don't have the ability to do that. So for many of the other occupants of our planet, sound and music is extremely important. It's the way that they communicate. It's the way that they discover their whole life around themselves. It's the way they go looking for a date or a mate.
Well, it's funny. You just said you put up the mammal of whales. The last whale tour I was on, the guide actually referred to the way that the whales communicate as their songs.
Yeah, I've heard that before too.
Yes. But besides their songs, they make clicks and scraping noises. And there actually has been research on those. And we have found that there's a 300 or 400 word vocabulary that they use. Because we've been able to experience them and we can see, hey, they're calling their buddies over. We're going to have a party. Or, hey, there's fish over here. And they've recorded them, seen how the response is with other whales, and then seen that repeated.
Are those
And as you're saying, the
incredibly loud
patterns,
underwater, the noises the whales make?
Actually, sound underwater travels for a long distance, but the amplitude is not capable of loudness. The reason why is because normally when we hear it, we're going through air. And air, of course, we have air pressure, right? And in the water, it's by far more dense. So the amplitude is actually harder to actually produce. But it travels for incredibly long distances. And this is why dolphins, whales use sound. The dolphins use sonar. And they use that so they can determine where they are. In underwater, smell is not really usable. In fact, some whales actually can't smell.
That's interesting. Wasn't there a whale? I think there was a documentary, The Loneliest Whale, where basically its noises were at a different frequency from the other whales. It was something like that. So it couldn't actually communicate correctly with them.
And that could be, and it could be because they were born with an abnormality. So it gave them difficulty. And that happens in human beings too, of course. We all have different capacities, and our voices come from our vocal cords. There are people who have vocal cords that are not developed correctly, and they have real problems speaking.
So let's go.
Go ahead, Don. Okay.
Well, I wanted to finish your thought because I want to take us back to early times.
Sure.
Go ahead.
And so Sound, even for us, is very important. We may not be able to see our prey, but we may be able to hear it. If you're walking along a street, you can hear the car that might hit you before you can see the car. Yeah, these are all important things. As humans, we are visually orientated. We are. But sound is also very important. And what is music? Music is sound.
So let me ask you this, and I don't know if you really know the deep history of this, but it's something that I found curious. What was the first musical instruments? For example, the musical instruments, if they found them, if archaeologists found them all the way back in Neolithic times, I mean, Cro-Magnon man and pre-Homo sapien, did they use musical instruments?
Well, the oldest, I would say, man-made instrument. We have to be very, very careful here because there are natural instruments. A gourd has seeds in it that have dried out. You take it, you shake it, and you create a shaker. Then there are man-made instruments that are made simply to make music. So what we have found, the oldest one is actually a flute. And it goes back about 60,000 years ago, and it was actually carved out of bone. And we found it actually in a cave. Neanderthals were living there, and we found it in a cave. The issue really is finding things that actually, first of all, can be identified as an instrument because they could be a number of things. And second of all, finding them actually intact. And from there, we actually have found some percussion instruments, interestingly enough, they were also carved out of bone. And by the way, they had ridges in them, so they're like a cowica. So they took them and they scraped them, probably with a stick, but possibly by themselves. And so these are what I consider to be man-made instruments. But you know from time immemorial, since man was able to actually, not even stand up, but get a log, get a piece of wood, hit the log. It creates a sound. It creates rhythm. It creates beat. That is a very important part to music. We think of harmony, we think of melody, think of beat.
Yeah, rhythm, tempo.
Yes.
I'm
Absolutely.
thinking of cavemen, some kind, a Geico commercial, people sitting around a cave,
Yes.
a campfire, playing a bone flute, and that was their main source of entertainment, right?
Absolutely.
With their families
Absolutely.
running around. That's really interesting. It's so universal, as you said before, in that sense.
We find in pictographs. We find in you even go to Babylonia where you've got drawings, and you've got the drawings, of course, of the Egyptians, and you find instruments. Predominantly, what I've tend to find, at least what I've seen, flutes.
I did not know flute was the first.
Yeah.
Is there a man-made instrument that musical historians would regard as kind of the most important invention that took music to a different spot?
The piano. It's not an
Yeah.
ancient instrument, but the piano really allowed us to, first of all, have a scale, and one that's expansive, 88 notes. Okay. The other thing that's important about it, because of the physics of how they did it, it actually had volume. Before that, you had harpsichords and clavinets, but the harpsichord, you plucked the string, and you couldn't get volume out of it. So you could compose on it, but if you're going to go there with even chamber music with, let's say, maybe 10 or 12 pieces, you would be drowned out. You simply couldn't hear the harpsichord. So it had limitations. The piano, or what we call the pianoforte, was a major invention because a composer could sit there and could not only think of the parts, but play the parts.
And do the kind of this, I want this to crescendo. And
Yes.
it's, yeah.
Yes, very,
You can play
very
pretty
important.
dynamically. Yeah.
And that really segues into the next kind of sub-subject, and that's about the branches of music as it's evolved music itself over millennia. I mean, I tend to think, and I may be oversimplifying it, is basically strings, keys, drums, many what I'm referring to as subcategories or even subspecies. How do you think each of these has sort of created a genre or a sort of subway of feeling of its own in the sense that they're all relaxing and pleasant and even inspirational, but in their own kind of ways. What do you think that's developed in that fashion, and what do you think the branches have developed that way?
Well, when you talk about that a feeling, we had talked about emotion, about conveying emotion, and the way you approach an instrument. There's really two things. This way, first of all, how you approach an instrument. For example, I can play a note, and it's a pretty simple note. It's just an E, and people would say that's pleasant, but I can go. I can simply hit it harder. And that's the same string that's sitting there at the same fret. But as I hit it stronger, it brings out different harmonics, and that also brings out different emotions. Another example, and this is
Sure.
another one, would be melody and harmony, how those are used. And those can be very specific because of the instrument that we happen to have. Just simply the scale, whether it's going to be an A440 or whether it's going to be, let's say, for example, a C660. By the way, I don't know that it's 660, but the idea is that also has a bearing. I play real low. I play real high. It has a sound. It has a timbre that's different. Even the intervals themselves, because that's really what we use. It's basically comes from the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, and just doing that. So I'll use two intervals here, very simple intervals, a root and a fifth. Yesterday, no. Anyway, so now let's change that.
Okay, I can do that. That's it. That's all I can do.
It's not a question of whether you can do it. It's what the combinations of them do. So we listen. I'm going to drop that by a half step. So instead of being basically an E, I'm going to drop it down to a D sharp. Now, wait a minute. What does that invoke in you? The difference between and, to me, it invokes a different feeling. Or if I do it descending,
yes. I mean, I don't have the ear you do, but or Steve does.
Now I'll change that. I'll go to half step. Same thing. It's basically a root, and I'm just taking that. I'm just doing a half step. I'm dropping it by a half step. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah, the second one is more dominant almost in that sense.
Yeah, and some people would say, well, that sounds more tense. It doesn't sound as
Well,
pleasant.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, the minor chords are always kind of a little, you'd use them for sad things or a bit more tense, versus the happy, shiny major chords.
Right, exactly. And what I'm really doing there is really a half diminished is what I'm actually doing. And that has an impact. And that's just on a guitar, okay? And so that, in my opinion, is probably the most important part when you're talking about simply emotion. It's the idea of a melody. We are attracted to melody. Think of Beethoven's Fifth. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. It's very simple, by the way. There's nothing complicated about it. But then, if you remember how it works, da 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 da. Now that's just one. That's just actually not one instrument, but it's just a small subset of the actual orchestra. And then the harmony takes over. And then the harmonies spread out. It's the same notes. It's how
I love this
harmony is expressed.
I love the science or the speculative science of what you just described, because you just mentioned from one of the simplest but yet most famous notes or chords or pieces of music in human history, and I would actually ask you if you think that was created or discovered. And the reason I ask that is because virtually all music historians would say that Mozart, for example, created music that wasn't there and wasn't discovered. He just created it from nothing. But whereas Beethoven, in that sense, in these simpler ones, as you just mentioning, more discovered it. Is that a distinction without a difference?
It's an interesting question. So Mozart and Beethoven lived in slightly different periods of time. And when Mozart's time, we had really just sort of introduced this idea of modern music theory. It came from Pythagorean theory, and the piano was I don't even remember if he used the piano. I believe he used the harpsichord for a lot of it, but he probably used an early piano. Mozart, on the other hand, Beethoven used a grand piano. That we had firmly established that. So those intervals that they were using, da 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 da, those had already been there. Somebody had already used those intervals. It's a fourth. I believe it's just the root. I believe it's just the root and the fourth is what it is. And they had already used those. Those have been used. You actually have to go, if you really want to find the innovator, go back to Bach. Bach is the innovator of Western classical music. And Bach definitely used the harpsichord. Okay. And so the notes were there, Don. They were. Now, how they were used is a different story. I'm assuming that da 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 had already been used, but it's what Beethoven does with that. It's what he takes with that and how he builds it out and how he puts his sense of harmony. That, I would say, at least from my perspective, I view that as being unique.
Yeah, it's not the ingredients. The ingredients were kind of there, the raw materials. It's
Yes.
how it was put together.
Yes.
Well, there's that famous moment in Amadeus when, and it's obviously pretty close to historically accurate, that where Salieri discovers that Mozart never made any corrections, and the reason he never made any corrections is because it was new. It wasn't anything to be corrected about it. It was completely something that didn't exist before Mozart. I use that example all the time for art.
Yeah,
All
he was
kinds of
like,
art,
these are
particularly in
first
sports.
drafts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
No
remember that,
drafts,
yeah.
just that's it. That's whatever comes out of his mind. He's speaking directly to God. That was Salieri's conclusion in that.
Yes, yes, yes. I would have to properly say what's a mistake and what's not. There have been plenty of times and things that I'm sure you're familiar with that the original composer went, well, that was kind of a mistake, but man, it works.
Well, we've both watched for hours and hours these videos that are now coming out about the Beatles, in which it's utterly incredible to watch, but the creative process in which they are just working on this stuff randomly, almost chaotically and sporadically at the beginning of some of the greatest songs that are ever written. And it's just parts of them. And they're looking at how do I, get back to where, how should we put this together? And you're like, no, say this, this. But it was that process in which they're sort of half discovering it within themselves, but half creating it at the same time as well. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting process, and I think it's hard for a lot of musicians to describe because you are kind of noodling, jamming, just kind of searching, iterating, and eventually you land on something. And yeah, in their case, a lot of some things that go down in history.
Absolutely. I can think of a number of compositions that I've done and with basically rock and roll bands because that's really what I spent a lot of time doing it. And there were things that I'd come up with, I would call it a framework. It might be something pretty simple, a couple chords, and of course, rhythm, a groove, something that they could groove. And then as the other members of the group would chime in, we would simply jam it out. And in that
Yeah.
jamming, new things definitely came about.
Yeah, it's synergistic. You start off, maybe somebody has a riff or a beat or, a bass line or something that they like that they've landed on. And folks kind of bring their own influence and contributions to it, and it, jam around, and it kind of
You can see
evolves
that
into
happening
something.
in that movie or the documentary Get Back with that last multi-week session that the Beatles had. And it is just absolutely fascinating, both from a psychological and we think more scientifically, all of us on the Don Sullivan show. And it is amazing to see how it just sort of seems to evolve from nothing into something that's an absolute point of genius. I always said that art, and I include sports in this, is the primary form, spring where genius comes, and genius is what changes the world, and that's why it's so important. Howard, I do want to get back though to a discussion we had, or a segment that we talked about before that we didn't kind of finish, and you brought up whales before, and I have to think of all of the creation in this discussion, but I want to talk a little bit more about animals that seem like whales. You can kind of, and all fish, I suppose, not they're mammals, obviously. They're all sea creatures you can think of in one sense. But what about birds? Clearly, birds are singing, especially in the spring. And they sing beautifully at times, and other times they're just cackling. But birds sing, don't they?
Oh, they do, and they do for different reasons. A lot of it really is they're really looking at the environment they're in and getting a feel for who else is around here. You know, another thing also, and it's important, the spring, I want to date, I want to mate. They're creatures just like us. And how are they going to do that? Like they can't write a letter. Once again, they don't have opposable thumbs. They can't get a pen out and do that. So what do? They use their vocal capabilities and they spread that out and they get an interaction with others. Okay, so that is a primary sound is for many creatures on this planet, it is their primary way of communication. They don't have a
I'm thinking
vocabulary.
about
Yeah.
wolves.
Sorry about that, Steve.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about wolves as well with the howling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, here's one. Dogs. Dogs will sing. I play with a
Really?
guy, and he's got a dog named Molly. Dolly's a Labradoodle, and Molly's an incredible dog. But if my friend goes ahead and plays, and he only plays the clarinet, Molly joins right on in, and she attempts to match it. She doesn't have the capabilities, but she makes a shot at that. She doesn't do anything else. It has to be the clarinet.
That's really
That's amazing.
interesting. Yeah, there are a lot of dogs. You see videos on the internet. Somebody will play a harmonica and they'll start howling with it, or some of them it just seems to calm them down. Dogs I've had, if you start playing guitar, they'll kind of just come in and sleep near you. They seem to like it as a calming
They
effect.
recognize those same harmonies in a pleasant, serene way, in a similar way to how we do.
That's true. However, Paul, who I'm playing, is not really into serene sounding anything. That's not his thing. Okay. So
Yes, Ozzy Osbourne would agree, right? So poor Ozzy, not in great health right now, but still, it's a whole different genre and it's a whole different way of looking at this
but I think that
incredibly broad spectrum of
what's,
music.
what's also kind of important here is they're also moved by sound, just like we are. So the cultural universal isn't just the human beings.
And it evolves within you too. And I always bring baseball examples, and right, I was always a fan myself in the 60s and the 70s of 60s and 70s rock. And then, of course, I'm from New Jersey, right, Steve? So it's Springsteen thing. But then all of a sudden, the Yankees are great in the late 90s, and I become a Metallica fan because of one song. And of course, people asked me what my favorite songs in the world are. I'd say, well, Enter Sandman, followed very closely by Frank Sinatra's version of New York, New York. That meant the Yankees. Mariano came in and the Yankees won. So that
those
all
are
of a sudden
very
became my
Yankee-centric.
favorite song. So
What?
hey, let's talk about.
Where does Springsteen? Where's Springsteen on that rating?
Well, Springsteen
Third, I guess.
This no, not necessarily. I mean, that's a good question, putting me on the spot. But I will tell you, from all the days that I was an athlete, many lifetimes ago, in this sense, every single day in my head, Born to Run went through it, and it still does. Every day, Born to Run is in there somewhere. So that's the inspirational part. For me personally, it needs to be intense. It needs to be incredibly dominant and powerful and intense. And I don't think anything gets more so than Born to Run in that way, because I was a runner. It totally is apropos too. So there you go. Hey, Howard, let's talk about another aspect of this. One that again is very close to both of our early academic days. I want to talk about the physics of this. So some physicists believe waves generated by music follow the exact same principles as other types of waves, whether or not they're waves in a liquid or sound waves or even light waves. And in fact, they believe that waves, even music waves, follow quantum principles and all of that. Do you believe all of that, or is that just sort of a convenient way to stick everything together?
I don't even believe it, but I have evidence and proof of it.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. We want to hear that.
Okay, sure. So we talk about in quantum physics, we talk about superpositioning. We talk about taking a particle or a wave, and the particles may in fact actually just be waves, There's a school of thought of that one. And what happens is you get them and they create a composite. It literally is wave one, wave two comes together to create wave three. Wave three is complex, becomes complex. So you have complexity. And of course, we also have the wave, well, the decoherence where it actually collapses. And that's a whole other area, and whether or not that's related to an observer or not. Now, I've done a lot of completely improvisational music. In fact, I do quite a bit of it. And what we tend to find is that I play a part, and let's say my partner that I'm playing with, Paul, plays a part. Those two parts actually will come literally together to create that third part. And when you hear that third part, it really is quite a bit different than either of the two parts that we are playing. And I really do believe that what we're experiencing is superpositioning. They're waves. I hit the string, that's a wave. That wave is occurring here. It's occurring in the quantum space just as well. And there's another thing that I've noticed that's really interesting, and that is patterns will emerge. So you can take two people, have them play, and you have nothing that's laid out. You don't know the key. You don't know the intervals. You just start playing. And we record this all the time. And what you tend to find is these patterns will just appear, and they don't last for very long, and they decouple. They literally decouple. It goes back into a chaotic state, and then it comes back later on. Well, that is a principle there that I think shows a very similar, to what to the actual things that are happening in the quantum world.
Yeah, subatomic particles that have extremely short half-lives that you cannot actually determine their actual position and momentum at the same time if you're actually looking at them and so on. If you're actually looking at them, they change for a moment and they effectively interact with your participation in their space and so on. So in other words, everything is affected by everything else in that extremely small but very profound manner.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we've also noticed is that as you add more participants, the chaos grows and the time is spent where it actually comes together to come up with a pattern shrinks. And it appears to be, as far as I can tell, exponential. As I add a person, it begins the amount of chaos and the amount of time between we get things that appear to be patterns changes.
So Howard, we're going to have a whole Don Sullivan show on this, and maybe more than one, because this is going to sort of branch off into the world of physics and wave dynamics, even quantum physics itself, and obviously we're going to have a lot of discussions on quantum computing as time goes along too. So this is really cool stuff, and looking at all of this come together and its overall effect on humanity is pretty incredible. And specifically when you use the term superpositioning, I think of it, and I know we're kind of moving back and forth from the historical versus the hardcore physics perspective, Steve, but I have an interesting thought that I've had for a long time, that there seems to be certain peaks and valleys historically in terms of the success and the production of historical music, and two that I think of, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and certainly the modern 20-year-olds right now might say I'm totally crazy and so on, but I tend to think of the Renaissance, from the Bach and Mozart time to Beethoven, and the 1960s all the way up to about the 1980s as being incredible peaks of creativity and profound success in historical music. Howard, do you think that fits into this same kind of success, lack of success, wave wave idea, or is it just a historical anomaly and luck?
Oh no, it's really not luck. It's an evolutionary process. All of it's an evolutionary process. As I mentioned, we started out with Pythagoras, who was 5th century BC, and he was really the father of it all. And he created Pythagorean theory, which was the accepted theory and it still really is, since that
all
time
of math.
frame.
It's all of mathematics.
But we had problems. We had problems that is, I have a guitar. I want to play with you. How do I do that? How do I make sure that we are on the same frequency? And as we change, as we move across the strings, the intonation that Pythagoras thought was going to be perfect, well, it's not quite perfect. And and then we need to have a written music that is universal, well, universal in the Western sense. And so that I can create something in Vienna, create it, and I can have a symphony in Paris play it, and I don't have to be there. Those things really didn't really come together until around the 16th century, and that was really important
Mm.
for the explosion of music.
Just like art, just like
Yes,
Renaissance art.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and so that was very important. The other thing that comes along, I mentioned it, was the piano, and they come about at around the same time.
So technological advancement is definitely a kind of a key factor.
It
What
opened
about
up the
social
door.
change? When I think of social change, I think of the 60s.
Absolutely. Now, the 60s, on the other hand, we have changes in technology. We have electric instruments. Now, the electric instruments really started in the 50s, right? But it became more fully utilized later on. So there was that explosion. And the interesting other part, and this is one that I think a lot of people don't realize, is the Beatles themselves and also members of the Rolling Stones, they all went to art school and they met in art school. They're not trained
Hmm.
musicians. They didn't go to Juilliard. They didn't go to that. They went to
Paul and
art
John met
school.
in church, right?
Well,
No.
absolutely. Well, the church for a long time really was.
Yeah.
If you wanted written music, the church was the only place that really did it for a long
Yeah.
time. Choral music, churches. Okay. If you folk music, you went to a tavern and there was maybe one or two minstrels that were playing there. Okay. That was much less formalized. So it does come from that. But now there's another thing that we cannot discount. When the Beatles first started, they were pretty much, they wanted to be Elvis. So they did a lot of early rock and roll songs. The Stones, on the other hand, were really blues based. Brian Jones was a
Yes.
blues fanatic.
Paul says that all the time, right? About the Stones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. But they made a transition. Both did, but the Beatles made the big transition. If you listen to the Beatles when they reached Rubber Soul, it's amazing. They're no longer just jingling and jangling on electric guitars. Now they're bringing acoustic guitars. George plays a sitar. He discovers the sitar. So this starts the expanding. Then they're no longer going, well, it has to be 2 minutes and 30 seconds long. Listen to the early stuff. Nothing's over 3 minutes long. So they're moving out. And let's be honest, everybody, they're using mind expanding substances at the same time. They are. Versus Victory
Drugs
Revolver,
make a difference too.
yeah. You listen Tomorrow Never Knows, and it's a John Lennon. It's a tape loop, but things going backwards, things going in and out. I think it's safe to say that mind expanding substances had quite a bit to do with that. And the Stones had their Symphonic Majesty's Request. That's was really their Sergeant Pepper's.
Yeah.
Howard, what about the impact of the commercialization of music? It's probably more of a product now than it kind of ever was. We moved from albums to singles, everything's digitized. Do you think that's had a net positive, a net negative, or just do you think that's changed
Oh, it's
music?
definitely changed. It's definitely changed by quite a bit. So at one time, you didn't write your own songs. You really didn't. You were more of a performer. You had a
Elvis.
lyricist, Carole King, lyricist. We had somebody write the music, Jerry Goffin. They were partners, by the way, and they worked in the
Sinatra
Brill
didn't write
Building,
his own song. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
and that's what you had in the Brill Building, and that's how things were done. So what happened, by the way, the Beatles were the big ones, and they wrote their own songs. So they broke out of that. Until that, if you think about it, music was extremely corporate in its own way. You really didn't have a whole lot of choice. Now, as you moved out into the 60s, you actually had, along with those slightly looser social mores, you actually had slightly looser control. And you really did. You had people like, I'm trying to remember his name, Joe, whatever it is, from Electra Records. He signs the doors. He's looking for something that's expanding. He's not even interested in that. Here's an interesting one. He would not let the guitar player use a wah-wah pedal on the first Doors record because Jimi Hendrix had already done that. And Jimi Hendrix had made that popular. So
Oh, that's
it's
interesting.
real.
He didn't want to. Yeah, he didn't want anything similar. He wanted it totally unique.
Exactly. Now, we actually had disc jockeys at that point, and let me tell you, I knew a few of them. They played whatever they wanted to play. As long as it somewhat fit into the format, they would play it. Okay? And as far as the program directors, as long as there's no dead air, it's fine with them. Now, that's changed, and that change started happening later on because they looked at monopolization. And you've got companies like Clear Channel who began to buy up radio stations. And when they bought them up, they gave it a format. Here's what you're going to play. And they didn't even use disc jockeys at points. They used cart machines, which are not really 8 tracks, but close. And all somebody would do is put the carts in the machine. And that's when we had AOR, country, these things became, you listen to a station, this is what they play. When I grew up,
the genres started taking over in that sense.
Right. Unless in AM radio, they played Motown. They would play Creedence Clearwater Revival, rock and roll. They would do all that. That changed dramatically in the 70s. And as the corporate entities took it over, they put it into more of a rigid time frame. This is what the DJ is going to do. This is how much time you do. You can't do anything else. Now we've moved into a part where the labels, the record companies, they're really, really almost not out of the picture, but they have a very diminished role. At one time, if you didn't have a label, you didn't get published. You had to have a distributor. Somebody actually put those singles in the actual stores. If you didn't have somebody do that, you could print as many as you want. You could be as good as you want. No one got to you.
Internet changed a lot.
It definitely, well, the internet leveled the playing field.
Yeah.
But it also means that everybody who at least has some modicum of talent can throw something out. And it means there's a lot of material out there. Let's be honest. Not all of it's great.
So, Howard, we only got a little bit of time left here, but I do have, I'm going to take my next 2 questions and put them together. And I have a feeling about this, and I think I know what your answer is going to be. But I'm going to put 2 questions together. Do you think music is more art or science? And especially given the tenor of this particular Don Sullivan show. And do you think musicians are athletes? And does that help if they're not?
Okay, when we talk about athletes, I think it's an interesting one because there's many things that are parallel to it. Don, I know that you were a major athlete at one time in your life. And so when you're a runner and you had to train, and that's what you did, you ran, you would feel your body, you would pay attention to nutrition, and you would do that because that's the way you become at a
maybe I should have paid a little more attention to nutrition. Well, I'd be better off now, but that's a different story. Different Don Sullivan show. Go ahead, Howard.
Okay. Now, to become a master level musician, it isn't any different. They talk about the 10,000 hours, and the separation is 10,000 hours. It's not. It's 30, 40, 50,000 hours. And it's going through scale studies, reading music, looking at it, writing it, and having it so that your brain is completely tuned into that, literally to the point where if you can think it, you can play it.
You forget how to do it wrong. That is an absolute principle in all athletics. You forget how to do it wrong. You have just trained yourself with muscle memory so long to do exactly the right thing, whether it's under pressure or it's just casual.
There's a lot of physicality too that goes with it. Yeah.
And there's also natural ability. So there are athletes who have the way that their hands are put together, the way that their elbows work, the way that they're born that way, give them a little bit of an edge.
Well, I'll think of a couple of different examples. Recently, I've seen the Stones, and at 82 years old, watching Jagger run on stage is utterly amazing. Springsteen obviously is breaking down a little bit, but he's been doing exactly the same thing at 70 up to 75 years old for many decades. But then you look at the comparison to the fact that ultimately you got to Prince, right? And Prince, for all of his antics and movement on stage, he really did break down terribly, and that's what caused his ultimate demise, right?
Yeah, he was. As it ended up, he had to be. He had to basically self-medicate, basically just to get around.
He was in a
And
lot of
happened to
pain.
Tom
Yeah.
Petty too.
Didn't know that, but
Yeah, Tom Petty in his last tour, which I saw, amazing show by the way, at Red Rocks. He could barely move, and he was using, I believe, he was using fentanyl, and he was just self-medicating to the point where it actually did kill him.
do you know that? Or
Yeah,
do you
they
mean
pretty much
yeah,
admit to that. They pretty much in the books out there
that's
admit that
unfortunate.
that's
Yeah,
what killed him. Yeah.
yeah. Back then, it was not quite as known as how devastating that could be. But back to the other question, part two. What do you think about it? Is it more art or science, music?
It's both. There's definitely a science. It's math. It's vibration. Pythagoras took a string. It vibrates, but he also decided as I change the length of the string, that vibration changes. The pitch
Yeah,
changes.
that's really good insight.
Yeah, and so we
Yeah.
created what we call our 12-tone systems. There's 12 notes between an octave. Okay. And he even went even further. He decided that he was going to look at the notes that sounded more pleasant or that sounded more mysterious. And he created the scale. So he created what's known as the major scale. All Western music is based upon the major scale.
Didn't know that. Do you know that, Steve? I didn't know that.
And even the minor scale, which we talk
when
about,
we're learning high school geometry,
major scale.
There are lots of wacky scales
we're learning high
out
school
there
geometry
too,
with Pythagorean theorem. It was, it's really about music.
No,
How about
if you go
that?
into world music, they've got Dorian, they've got all the kind of weird scales that sound kind of foreign. I would think to kind of Western ears, but they're cool.
Yeah, these were all done independently. So in the Middle East and in Asia, they had their own developments that were going on. And those developments, especially in Asia, are not based upon the same 12-note system that we have.
I didn't know
And in
that.
fact,
That's
in
really
India,
interesting.
when you think about Indian music, you think of sitars. Those have movable frets. So the actual scale itself, the intervals themselves, the vibrations themselves as the hertz can be changed. We don't do that in Western music. In fact, our guitars are fretted. They're fretted, so that way when we play, it sounds harmonious.
Yeah, you're locked in.
But Harrison was able to add it into Beatles music.
In the Middle East, if you ever listen to an oud player, they don't have frets. So when you hear it, it has a sound. You'll notice that sound. You can hear that.
Yeah. And sometimes it can sound more dissonant to us because it's not as structured in a way.
Exactly. And dissonance is a part of music. It's a part of our lives.
Oh, absolutely. And on some songs, it's critical, especially that when the dissonance breaks into something that's harmonious again, it can really punch things up in an amazing way.
Absolutely. So, and this is all science. Pythagoras basically based it upon the relationship. He based it on ratios. Pythagoras was not only a philosopher, he was an astronomer, he was a mathematician.
Yeah, of course he was. Pythagorean theorem is all of geometry. Hey, Howard, we don't have much time left here. In fact, we're over time, which is what we can do on the Don Sullivan Show anytime we want. But I will ask you this one last question to sort of wrap this up, and we're going to have you back, I hope, for many more of these episodes in a maybe more narrow fashion. But where is this all going? Where do you see music going when we're long gone in the next 100 years?
Okay, so we're actually starting to see the start of it, at least from my perspective. And one of the ones is becoming a cliche. It's AI. It's going to become very major. Right
Artificial
now,
intelligence,
it's really what I would call derivative works. It
Yeah.
takes what they've been able to pull out, scrape out the individual instruments, that's called stemming, and then from there, finding other things and joining them together. But it's a derivative work. It's not a truly creative work. But will it
No.
become that way?
Ah, yes, that's a question all about AI.
One of my buddies used to drive around in a beat up Subaru. He's also a drummer. And he had a bumper sticker on the back. It's one of those cars that had lots of bumper stickers. Vermont dude. The sticker said, "Drum machines have no soul." So I guess my question for you, Howard, will AI be something that kind of sucks the humanity out of music? Or I guess as long as there's a human in the loop, will it be something that enables us to take it further and evolve it into new places?
I think it's going to be, I myself am more positive about it. And the reason why is because I've been using these new generative tools, and they really give you the ability to take you into different places. So I find them very useful, especially with hybrids. I use that to generate and I'll listen. And then from there, I take it and I put a little bit of me in there. And they also have the ability for you to adjust that. And so I'm driving it to a certain degree. And these algorithms are not necessarily all that complicated to start with. I'm going, yeah, major scale, minor scale. But
They're arithmetic mostly at the moment. Yeah.
But I've got across a couple of one, and I'm going to say, who wrote the code for this?
Mm-hmm.
This is almost a lie. But I think it brings up another point: is will it ever reach the point where it will create? Remember that we use emotion. We're throwing out emotion. Will AI ever be able to do that?
That's the question about all of AI.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can we have it study the
All right.
past classics and masterpieces and figure out something new based on
Well,
that?
we will that, but
Yeah.
can it actually reach that next level into real neural networks to create synapses for every nano emotion? That's a word I made up, but nano emotion that we experience, or any sentient creature experiences. All right, we think we got to end it up now. Howard, this has been absolutely fascinating. And again, thank you so much for bringing your expertise in this area. It's one of the things we do on the Don Sullivan Show here. We know that there are so many people that we all know that have expertise in areas that weren't necessarily their professions, and we are going to bring them all to light, and we are going to interview them all over the next number of years here on the Don Sullivan Show. And with that, Steve, you want to sign us out and let me end us up?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Howard. Pleasure having you on with us.
Thank you, Howard.
Pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
And remember, folks, all at bats are situational. Thank you.